Hi, Misha here, and probably going to entitle this video something like MiG Alley. This is an overview of some, or really most, of the major MiG variants used by the Soviet Union from right after World War II through the end of the USSR. And all the models except one on the table are from Hobbymaster. And I just thought we would do a basic overview, and then I'll do individual videos on these. And jet fighters tend to be broken up more or less into generations. So on the end here we have really the first generation. On the left is the MiG-15, known as the FAGOT. Hey, that's what NATO called it. Then we have the MiG-17, known as the FRESCO. And really, the 17 is just a greatly evolved 15. Well, right after, Russia, like everyone, had dabbled with jet aircraft during World War II. And there were several early attempts, or kind of semi-jets, blah, blah, blah. The MiG-9 was one of the earliest, and that led directly to the MiG-15 here. This first flew in 1947, and then went into service in 1949, and was a swept-wing, lightweight, single-engine fighter, essentially in the same kind of vein as a prop plane, but with a jet engine. This was primarily equipped with two 23mm cannon, as well as a larger 37mm, and the idea was basically to intercept and shoot down bombers. Dogfighting was kind of secondary. And really early on, these weren't carrying much in the way of ordnance. They did have underwing pylons, too, but mostly they were used for fuel tanks, and then they could be used for just basically dumb bombs. It's also some Generation 1 planes could have unguided rockets, basically dumbfire at a big target like a bomber, and, hope for the best. This was not supersonic. After about Mach 0.9, 0.92, things got real hairy and out of control, so it was a subsonic fighter. Very famous in Korea. First we would have Russian piloted ones, and then Chinese and eventually Korean throughout the war. And this would be used by a number of nations, about 20 of them, and produced in quite large numbers. And it was capable of going up pretty high, about 50,000 feet. And this particular one from Hobbymaster is actually a East German, a DDR edition, for what that's worth. The 17 originally was just going to be an improved MiG-15. The idea was, after the 15 saw a little combat, they would use the feedback to make a new version. Well, so many changes were made that it ended up being a whole new fighter. One of the big changes, the sweep to the wings would be have different angles to it. Actually, just side to side, the wings are slightly shorter, but the surface area is greater because of the sweep. And the plane's just a little bit longer. This is still, it's what they call transonic. It's really bumping up on the edge. It can go a little faster, but still really can't cross that sound barrier and still be controllable. Like the 15, it's still armed with 3 cannon. Still has 2 underwing pylons. And really this began to fly quite early on. Around 1950 was its first prototype flight. And it started to see service by 1952, but it was not in time for the Korean War. By 1953, these were still not available. And it was a reasonably successful plane. It was used by a few more nations, about 25, including Vietnam. And that led next to the one we don't have from Hobbymaster, the 19. I'll just briefly say the MiG-19 was the first of the second generation. Basically, it was supersonic. It could go about Mach 1.2. It was a little bigger, had 2 engines. But the downfall of the MiG-19 was that it had very limited fuel. And really with Generation 2 fighters, you start to see a little bit of a split between true fighters and interceptors. The idea behind a true fighter, of course, it would dogfight and also could attack the ground. An interceptor, in theory, would have longer range and ability to climb very high, but would be limited in other ways. Well, the 19, despite its speed, had very limited fuel. They did up its abilities somewhat. Instead of having 2 cannon of different sizes, or 3 of 2 different sizes, they would actually go to 3 30mm cannons. Well, it was found when you had a 23 and a 37mm cannon on a plane, the point of impact was radically different, which made aiming very difficult. So they would go to 3 of the same for the 19. And this, the second generation era, was really when missiles, guided missiles, started to come into use. Early ones were basically infrared. They would also play around with radar, radio-controlled ones, but this was early days. Also, Generation 2 planes would use more advanced alloys for construction, more modern techniques, so on and so forth. And really, these were the first planes to be built with the whole nuclear threat in mind. So, yeah, interception, interdiction of bombers, and so on and so forth. The 19 really wasn't that successful. It was mostly an interim step, made in much smaller numbers than the previous planes. But it would kick Russia off into the supersonic, and that would lead to this plane here. An extremely famous plane, the MiG-21. This would go through a few different evolutions, but after years of testing, it would go into Russian service in 1959, and the first of these would appear in Vietnam in 1966, where they were used to great effect. It's an interesting plane. It's quite lightweight. The idea was to have a Mach 2 capable fighter. This was also Russia's first successful interceptor. Although early versions still had limited fuel, it was better than the 19. Interestingly, it had this nose cone, which could be adjusted depending on the flight, profile, speed, so on and so forth, which led to its nickname of Balalaika, or the pencil. But basically still, it's a very lightweight, very simple, very Soviet fighter. And to that end, because it was so easy to fly, maintain, and use, and so inexpensive, these are actually still in service today, believe it or not. Of course, they've been modernized a great deal since then, but they were used by over 60 nations, and the most produced supersonic jet fighter, and the most produced military fighter of the post-Korean War era, and for a long time had the longest production run until they were surpassed by the F-16 and F-15. But a lot to say about this, so when we get to its own individual video, it will, yeah. Something else about the second generation, this still has a cannon, but only one. On the other hand, it has 4 missiles. This era, starting in the 60s, the idea was they were thinking that using guided missiles would be more and more important, even beyond visual range. Of course, these planes would increasingly have more effective radar, so on and so forth. By the way, this one here, which I just kind of like, is from the Finnish Air Force. A lot of people bought these. India and Finland. I mean, it wasn't just the Soviet allies. It was just a good plane. And like everything, it had shortcomings, but it actually did very well. The 15 would go up against the F-84 and F-86 Sabre. Of course, the 17 and 19 would go up against more modern planes like the F-100 Super Sabre, and the MiG-21 most famously went up against things like the F-4 Phantom and other members of the Century series like the F-105. Well, let's move on. Moving on. Oh, by the way, the NATO code for the MiG-21 was FISHBED. And now I'm going to mix things up and actually talk about the MiG-25 first. The FOXBAT. And then we'll come back to the 23. As I said, beginning in Generation 2, there was starting to be more of a split, specializing in fighters and interceptors. So when Russia rolled into the third generation, we really see this. The MiG-25 here is our interceptor, whereas our MiG-23 is our fighter and light ground attack bomber type thing. The 25 is a very interesting plane with a very interesting story. And the reason I'm starting here first, this actually began before the 23. Work began in the late 50s. The first prototype would fly in 1964, but this would not actually enter into service until 69. This was originally conceived as an extremely high performance, high altitude interceptor and long-range patrol craft. It was capable of lots of achievements. In fact, it set many world records in the 60s, 70s, and some still even stand today. Many others were only broken by the SR-71 Blackbird, which was not a fighter, as you know. The MiG-25 could go up to Mach 2.8 without much sweat, and could cross over Mach 3, but there were risks to damaging the engines. It also was capable of extreme high altitude. Previously, with the 15, 17, we were at about 50,000 feet. We were creeping up to 55,000. We'd hit about 60,000 with some of the MiG-21s. This guy here, though, when fully loaded up with armaments, could get up to about 68,000. When partially loaded, could bump 80,000. And in tests, when it was more of a performance model, it set records of over 115,000 feet. It was even starting to scrape the edge of space at nearly 120,000. So it could go up there and it could go fast. Now, to get this kind of performance, we have this very large wing, and to withstand the heat and the stresses, they had to make it out of stainless steel primarily, with a mix of titanium and a few other alloy bits. It was pretty cost-intensive to manufacture, at least for Russian standards. It was equipped usually with 4 air-to-air missiles that were both heat-seeking and radar-guided. It had a very powerful radar, However, its radar had a shortcoming. Remember, this, again, development stretched back all the way to the late 50s. The radar, while powerful, was not look-down, shoot-down capable, which becomes important later. This was designed to interdict, intercept, and shoot down bombers flying at very high altitudes, which was the standards of that time. But later on, bombers would start to fly low, kind of hugging the terrain, and this could not effectively shoot them. It did not have a cannon, and mostly it was used by Russia. Very impressive craft. Now, in 1976, Viktor Belenko most famously defected from Russia and landed in Japan, bringing with him his MiG-25. The U.S. studied it and then returned it because manners. But this actually led them, kind of got them off their butts to introduce a more effective radar in 1978. And these would be kept in production until about 1984, 1985. And actually would lead to the MiG-31, which is still very much flying today in Russia. Plenty of MiG-25s are flying elsewhere in the world. These were used by Iraq during the Gulf War. They were also used by Libya, which actually this model here and the 23 beside it are in Libyan Air Force scheme. And the MiG-25 has the distinction of having the only air-to-air kill of an American jet in the first Gulf War, 1991. One of these, operated by Iraq, shot down an FA-18. And there are several other engagements with F-15s. And there's a very interesting story with this plane and the F-15. But I'll shut up now about this because this is still just an overview. You can't tell. It's something I really like. And the model is really neat too. But we'll get to that shortly. The 23, on the other hand, was the fighter complement to the 25. This first flew as a prototype in 1967 and went into service in 1970. And it was meant to address the shortcomings of the MiG-21. Most importantly, it was meant to have better takeoff and landing performance, better range, fuel. It also had more hard points for weaponry. Still retained a cannon though. And it had variable geometry wings. The wings could be moved to 3 or 4 positions, I forget. But anyway, this could change its performance and lift and drag and all that good stuff. So more of a conventional fighter. They could also double as a bomber. It was still quite fast. It was about 2.3 Mach. And still had a good altitude. It could get up to about 60,000 feet. So was no slouch. It did have look-down, shoot-down radar capability. In fact, it was Russia's first production aircraft to have that. Again, it was a slightly newer design, frankly. I think Russia had a lot of big plans and hopes for this. But a lot of foreign customers weren't interested because while it was, to some extent, an improvement over the 21, it was also more expensive and difficult to maintain and train pilots on. It didn't have that rough elegance of the 21, so actually it wasn't used a whole lot outside of Russia. That said, both Iraq and Libya, again, did use it, and, several others, but it wasn't the runaway success like the 21. And the 25 was never meant to be a huge success. It was a very specific role. Whereas the 23 was kind of meant to be the 21's replacement. But frankly, the 21s stayed in service even after the 23s were introduced. And these were produced until about 1985. And Russia would retire these out of its own military in the late 90s. So, none are still flying today. Kind of an understated aircraft, but still definitely important to the MiG family. And it definitely has its own assets. The variable wings have pros and cons, as they do on any plane. But, yeah. And this was called the FLOGGER. I don't know. I think they should have named one of these the FROGGER. What do you think? I think they should have. And it would actually lead to the MiG-27, which was a dedicated ground attack version. Whereas this was a multi-role fighter. And it's like other Generation 3 aircraft. It would have more advanced avionics, more advanced radar, more advanced missiles. You know, just they would start to go away from things like gauges, you know, mechanical gauges, to more modern type controls. Fly-by-wire would start to appear in the 3rd generation, although it really didn't become ubiquitous to the 4th. So on and so forth. Interestingly, this had solid-state electronics. The 25 still used vacuum tubes, but even though it seemed like pretty dated technology by the 70s, they did have a few benefits. For example, they weren't as susceptible to pressure and temperature changes. Always good in Russia, everything given. And, well, they weren't susceptible to something like an EMP, so there is that. Well, let's finish things up. And to wrap things up, we have the MiG-29, originally designated as the FULCRUM. By NATO, this was picked up by Russians as an informal name as well. And really, this was one of the last Soviet-era fighters, making up Generation 4, which was kind of a return to the idea of dogfighting and kind of an air superiority fighter. Also, use more and more of small computers and advancements, but it still had a cannon. The idea was still visual range fighting as possible. They learned lessons from earlier times. And this is the only non-Hobby Master on the table. That is because Hobby Master doesn't make a MiG-29. This is a JC wings. And pretty much an evolution of the old Whitty wings mold. I find it very odd that Hobby Master doesn't do 29, but there it is. This one is a Russian style, circa 1991, so right at the end of communism. Very basic MiG-29. Now this plane has an interesting story behind it, much like the 25 before it. Back in '69, right as the 23 and 25 were coming online, the Russian government basically wanted a one-size-fits-all fighter that could take off and land at very austere, primitive runways. That was durable, easy to maintain, long range, capable of attacking air targets, ground targets, blah blah blah. Basically everything. Well, they soon realized this wasn't realistic, and the program got split up into a light tactical fighter and a long range interceptor type fighter. But both planes were still a little more multi-role than previous. You know, the 25, as neat as it was very specific. Well, these new planes were going to be a little bit of able to do other things. Now, the MiG would end up being the light tactical. The heavy long range would end up being the Sukhoi Su-27. Anyway, work would begin in 1974. First flight would be in 1977 of a prototype. These would be put into production in 81 and then into service in 82 in Russia. This is a very good, well-balanced, and very modern fighter. It was capable of Mach 2.3, had a ceiling just under 60,000 feet, loaded up, had 7 hard points for bombs, missiles, extra fuel tanks, so on and so forth. And yeah, it was just kind of a very modern, I don't want to say understated, but very, very Soviet-style fighter. Rugged, dependable, everything. And it's just very, to me, iconic of 1980s Soviet Union. It just has that look to it and feel. It's actually a very small plane compared to the 25. Kind of return a little bit to the older MiGs. And thanks to it using computers, these were easy to upgrade. And there have been many variants over the years. The 29S was one of the early ones. These, of course, remained in service well into the Russian Federation era, still in service today. They were also used by many other nations, about 30, although most of them used them in relatively small numbers, just because. Unfortunately, a lot of the ones in Russia have been allowed to basically rot and are no longer serviceable. There was a long list of crashes and incidents in the early 21st century. In fact, the fleet was grounded in 2008, and it seems like about a half of them were just basically written off as junk, which is a shame because many of them weren't that old. But they went back to flying in 2009. The government did talk about replacing them in 2013, but then in 2014 they turned around and ordered brand new MiG-29 SMTs, one of the newer variants from MiG, so they're still using them. Unfortunately, the Russian Federation has kind of favored the Su-27 and its variants. There's a whole family of those, like the Su-33 and the Su-34, and even some Su-35s in limited service, as well as, of all things, the MiG-31, which was the evolution of the 25. So the 29, while a great fighter, kind of ended up being a little bit neglected and put in the back seat. But still a very impressive plane, and while I pretty much buy Hobbymaster, I had to have a 29 in the collection. I do have a few others. I do have some Corgis, and if you look at my space videos, I do have some Dragons, so I'm not exclusive, but I kind of like what I like. So yeah, like I said, this is a general overview. Give you an idea. Pretty much going to give each of these their own video. These are all die-cast, 1/72 scale. Most of these are quite heavy, especially that 25. And even the JC has a good... I'm actually pretty impressed with it. This is my first JC. I did have a Witty wings before, but... sorry guys, there we go. Yeah. I like all of these. The 15 for being the original, you know, up against the F-86. 17's neat. It's probably, just because it's so close to the 15, maybe my least favorite, but that's not to say I don't like it. I definitely do. But it's just, it's so close, honestly. The 21, I like that this is from Finland. I just love that weird look to it. And the 23, I like it, but it's probably my least favorite next to the 17, just because it's a little less MiG-like, you know, it's just kind of there. And it's so much overshadowed by the 25, which is quite possibly my favorite. Although, again, the 29 is so iconic that it would be hard for me to pick between the 15, the 25, and the 29. But each of them has their place. And I love how much history. And don't worry, we'll get into the SUs, the Suhois. But this is enough for one video, and figure we'd start here. As I said in my Japanese fighters video, most of these came from Pete's Collectibles down in Houston, Texas. The JC wings came from Diecast Supermarket. That's why I actually ended up with that Japanese 2A, the Mitsubishi, because I was getting the 29 and they had that 2A on sale. So yeah, I have to really give credit. The 15. These haven't actually been out in a few years from Hobby Master, and Pete's Collectibles has not had them listed on the website. But I think people get the idea, I don't know why, about me and history and my love. Long story short, Pete down there found me one. Actually, he found me two different ones, but I went with the East German. But, I mean, that's service above and beyond. And I'm not saying he can do that every time. I mean, but it was just a good coincidence and a good happenstance for both of us. So, cool. I was certainly happy. Alrighty, guys. Well, it's late, and I'm tired, and you're probably tired of hearing me. So, for now, we're going to sign off, but I'll be back soon with more of this, and of course more details on each of these. If you have any questions or comments, do please post them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. And catch you very soon next time.